Very warm welcome to everyone. We're delighted to have you here for our exciting plenary session on the transforming organizational culture. My name is Olivier Delarue. I'm the lead of UNHCR Innovation and delighted to be the facilitator of this session. I would like to introduce you our esteemed panelists, starting with Jeff Crisp, who has been with UNHCR for many, many years. He has a great career in the humanitarian world. He is right now a research fellow at the Refugee Study Center. Emily Arnold Fernandez, she's a director of Asylum Access, and you have seen in a bio what Asylum Access does. We have Marpe Tanaka, who is the innovation lead of the innovation unit at MSF. And then Andrew Bilo, who is a humanitarian affairs officer at UNOCHA in New York. This is a very interesting subject because it is at the heart of what we do in the humanitarian world. We're here to enable people, creating an environment where creativity can be fostered, nurtured, and captured. And this is what we're delighted to have the panelists today to explain a little bit more and dive into this idea of transforming the culture of an organization. Jeff, we'd like to start with some opening remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Olivier. It's a great honour to be on this panel, although I'm not absolutely sure why I was invited to be on it. I think it had something to do with the fact that I spent more than 25 years with one humanitarian organisation, UNHCR, so I guess inevitably over that time I got to know the organisational culture a little bit. And it also has something to do with the fact that as head of policy development and evaluation, promoting change was an important component of my job. But I suspect that the main reason I got invited to be on the panel is that my office is right next door to Humanitarian Innovations Project at the Refugee Studies Centre, so proximity played a part in this, I think. To be honest, before I got this invitation, I hadn't really given much systematic thought to the whole notion of organisational change. So I just wanted to kind of give you 3 or 4 thoughts that came to me when I started to think about it. First, I think that although organisational culture is a concept that we use very regularly in the humanitarian field, I think that actually identifying the culture of any organisation, humanitarian or otherwise, is actually an extremely difficult task because cultures are rarely, if ever, codified. They derive largely from the assumptions, perceptions, common practices and sentiments of the organisation's personnel, and they can be quite difficult to pin down and to contrast from one agency to another. Secondly, while it's probably possible to identify some very broad characteristics of an organisation's culture, in UNHCR it always struck me that organisational subcultures based on function, seniority, national and regional origin and personal traits played just as prominent a role in the life of the organisation as the overall organisational culture. And indeed, one might say that internal competition for visibility and internal competition for resources is a primary characteristic of UNHCR's culture, and I suspect of other humanitarian agencies as well. Third, in terms of actually transforming organisational culture, which is the subject of our panel today, I suspect that this is rarely achieved by means of a purposeful or conscious process. Looking back on my time with UNHCR, I think I'd have to conclude that some of the most important changes to the organisation's culture came about as a result of scandals that damaged the organisation's reputation, as a result of changes at the most senior levels of management, as a result of the evolving accountability agenda, and as a result of the increasingly competitive nature of the humanitarian marketplace. And talking of the competitive nature of the humanitarian marketplace, if I could just give one example of where I've seen a very distinct change in UNHCR's organisational culture, and I'm speaking here as somebody who joined the organisation as an external and media relations officer. I've been totally astonished by the way in which over the years the amount of time, effort and money that's devoted to branding and celebrity endorsement has just increased phenomenally, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. And, you know, I'm a little bit of a skeptic on this one. You know, sometimes I get the sense in UNHCR that a front page picture of Angelina Jolie wearing a UNHCR baseball cap is simply assumed to be good for the organisation and therefore good for refugees. And I'm not sure that assumption, I think that assumption needs to be tested a little bit more. But certainly branding and celebrity endorsement has become a very key feature of UNHCR's organisational culture, which was completely non-existent when I joined back in 1987. And then finally, I hope I'm not being too controversial, but I think this is a topic we'll come back to later, I'd just like to ask whether innovation units have a significant impact on organisational culture as a whole. As far as UNHCR is concerned, I think the jury is probably still out on that question. While the innovation unit has been the source of many important new initiatives, particularly in the technological domain, I've encountered a common sense amongst former colleagues in UNHCR that UNHCR has always been innovative, and it didn't take the establishment of a dedicated innovations unit for that to happen. At the same time, and I suspect this is a sentiment that Olivier and his colleagues have often encountered, there is certainly a sense amongst some of my former colleagues that the whole notion of innovation is a passing trend and will in time be overtaken by some other new enthusiasm. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Moving from a large organization, UNHCR, to a much more agile, smaller organization.
Sure.
Emily.
And since I think I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about our work later, I'm going to open my remarks by maybe shifting us from talking about individual organizational cultures to the ecosystem and how organizational cultures fit together within the refugee response humanitarian space. And to do that, I'd like to talk about something that I think is a little bit of an elephant in the room, although Niels Harald here has been doing his best to talk about the elephant throughout the conference, which I very much appreciated. And that is the restrictions that are placed on refugees. So as we think about our role as humanitarians, as humanitarian responders to refugee crises in specific, we're confronted by a world where refugees are continually hemmed in by restrictions, sometimes physical restrictions, barbed wire around refugee camps, the inability to leave. I mean, we call that internment. We did it to the Japanese in my country during World War II, and it's something that's a shameful blot on our country's history. And yet that has been our primary mode of response to refugees for the last 60 years. And there are intangible restrictions, right? Prohibiting refugees from working. You have people who want to work. Everywhere else in the world, we're trying to reduce social safety nets and get people off welfare. And in the humanitarian space, we're still approaching refugee needs from the perspective of insisting that people remain on welfare, if you will, and not changing the landscape so that they can work. And I think the traditional ecosystem, the traditional response of the humanitarian ecosystem has been a culture in the humanitarian space of meeting humanitarian needs. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That's kind of the obvious when someone comes across a border and they need some place to sleep, they need some food to eat, they need to make sure that they can have their medical needs attended to. It makes sense that our culture as an ecosystem has been really focused on how do we meet needs. The problem is that when restrictions are sitting there in the middle, we meet humanitarian needs, and then those needs come up again the next day. And that's where I think that Asylum Access has tried to be at the vanguard of a cultural shift in the ecosystem to add, not to eliminate meeting needs, but to add the goal of ending humanitarian needs. So starting from restrictions, starting from this place of refugees have a lot to offer, but they're hemmed in by all of these restrictions. How do we eliminate these restrictions? How do we help refugees assert their rights, right? Because refugees do have the rights to work, the right to go to school, the right to engage in their communities. How do we eliminate the restrictions that prohibit them from doing that? How do we help refugees assert their rights so that refugees can meet their own needs? So that rather than simply having a culture only of meeting humanitarian needs, we also have a culture of ending humanitarian needs. And that's the Asylum Access vision, that refugees are not just people with needs, but also people with rights, and that by ensuring that refugees can enjoy their rights, we make it possible for them to meet their own needs. So I'll go ahead and stop there and let us go on.
Thanks, Emily. Let's move towards Marpe, who obviously representing MSF, another very innovative organization.
Yes, thank you very much. So I represent MSF, Sweden Innovation Unit, and we are one of these units that you described in this panel description, that do we need these units or dedicated departments? So I think we do, definitely, but this is not the goal, having these units, but rather to reach out to the whole organization, making sure that innovation and change towards more adaptive organization is created. And I think that MSF is already that. We have, because of what we do, working with emergencies, with many years of background, there is so much innovative capacity, especially in the field. But how do we do to make sure that all of these ambitions that individuals and groups within the organization has can be absorbed and moved up and really get the attention and ultimately also be developed in a way that impacts our beneficiary and our patients the best way possible. This is, I think, this is the key question, really. And when we started 3 years ago, I think it was, then we were already thinking about this. In order to have big impact when it comes to innovation, you have very close links to change, of course, transformation. But being a partner section, I don't know how many people here knows the setup of MSF, but we have different operational centers and partner sections. So we were not deeply involved with operations. So we could not come in and say, hey, we need to do like this or like that. So we realized we need to have these quick wins, like concrete cases, innovation cases, to show that there are ways to work by having an approach that also include external stakeholders that can match our needs and requirements from the field with resources and competences that we may not have. Yeah. And by doing this, also I think that you start this change of attitudes, of culture, and now 3 years later I can say that we already see this change within the organization, and it's of course something that has happened everywhere because of the change of attitudes is of course not something that just happened within an organization. It's, as you say, the ecosystem and the whole debate has moved in that direction, and we follow that, of course. And there are other initiatives, innovation initiatives in all the OCs basically in MSF. So this is something that grows, and it's a social evolution within the movement also. So we need to find these different nerves that are the most efficient to reach to this cultural change that we're talking about. So, yeah.
Thanks, Marpe. Andrew, would you like to give some perspective from your UN agency perspective?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Olivier, and delighted to be here these past couple of days and speaking with all of you. And I have the good fortune of going last, so a lot of the key points I think have already been raised in this discussion. So I'll keep my comments brief. But obviously, working at UN OCHA, our position is very central within the UN system and the humanitarian system more broadly. As an organization, we're tasked with coordinating humanitarian affairs across the humanitarian space, and that extends also to innovation as well. And so we have a responsibility to connect the different players within the humanitarian space, working on innovation. So far, that connection has been relatively absent, I think, and it's really not a week, if not a day, that goes by that we hear about some new innovation, invention, something that's coming out of the field that we maybe don't know about, or that we should have known about months before because we might be pursuing a similar project. And I think that's something that all of us collectively have to work toward addressing more effectively, is how we communicate across the system these different projects and programs. Because obviously the needs are increasing, but there's also increasing pressure on us to show the effectiveness of what we're delivering as a community. So perhaps I'll just leave it there and we can get into the substance of the conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Jeff, I wanted to ask you, as you said, you have been working with UNHCR for 25 years plus. You even commissioned studies on organizational change. What do you think are the best or the biggest barriers to organizational change within a large humanitarian organization such as UNHCR?
Sure. Yeah, in fact, one of the reports that we commissioned before I left the organisation was actually called The State of UNHCR's Organisational Culture. And I think it's one of the kind of fairly rare example of a study of a specific organisational culture. And in the comments I'm going to make in the next couple of minutes, I'll be drawing from the evidence presented in that independent review. So I think the first major barrier to organisational change and cultural change in UNHCR is that of being a crisis-oriented agency focused on short-term modes of operation, which I think leads to a lack of effective reflection and longer-term thinking, as well as an inability to learn from experience and make full use of evaluations and their recommendations. And if I can just give you a quote from the report that I just mentioned, it says, I quote, UNHCR has a high-profile evaluation unit that maintains a determined policy of transparency with regards to its findings and recommendations. A number of people commented, however, that even reports from this unit do not seem to go anywhere, in the sense that they seem to have little impact, are not taken up by the rest of the organisation, nor do they result in sufficient concrete debate, reflection and outcomes. So evaluation doesn't necessarily lead to change if the attitudes are not right within the organisation. A second barrier to change that I would identify is the growing demand on staff members to comply with reporting, planning, results-based management and accountability requirements. And if I can quote from one staff member who's quoted in that report, he said, reports and plans are useful tools, but the processes have become too elaborate and too time-consuming. We are being sapped dry of all creativity. And according to another staff member quoted in that report, he said, under the old planning system, we had a heart attack once a year, but now we're in a state of chronic anxiety. We are in permanent planning mode and have little time to devote to reflection and innovation. At the same time, I think I'd like to suggest that the decreased creativity of UNHCR staff has somewhat ironically been associated with the introduction of new technologies, because we're often thinking of technology being a force for innovation, but I think some of the evidence in our report suggests that the introduction of email, internet, mobile phones over the last 15, 20 years has actually limited people's creativity and their time for reflection. And at the risk of sounding like a complete Luddite, numerous staff members have told me, UNHCR staff members have told me, that they used to spend a large part of their time actually in the field, mixing and talking with refugees, and in the process developing a better understanding of their needs, their aspirations, and the way in which those needs and aspirations might be best met. These days, they say, they are confined to their office for most of the time, while those offices themselves are, for security reasons, located further and further away from the locations where refugees actually live. And chronic funding shortfalls are a further reason for the isolation of UNHCR staff from on-the-ground problems and opportunities. In the words of one former colleague, nowadays we try to avoid meeting refugees because our answer to every question has to be, sorry, I can't do that for you. A third issue is that of institutional arrogance, meaning that UNHCR staff sometimes regard their work as superior to and more important than other humanitarian organisations, and are consequently unwilling to learn from those other organisations. According to another staff member interviewed for the review that I mentioned a minute ago, I quote, there is a feeling that UNHCR is at the top of the pile in its field, a sense of insularity which leads to an organisational culture that has little connection to the rest of the UN agenda. Now, where exactly this arrogance comes from, and I think most of us who have worked in UNHCR would recognise this notion of arrogance, where exactly this arrogance comes from is a question that's always baffled me. I think it has something to do with the very specific protection mandate given to the organisation, the heavy concentration of power vested in the personality of the High Commissioner, himself or herself. But I also think that the arrogance of UNHCR has quite a lot to do with the emergence of perceived new competitors in the humanitarian marketplace, especially OCHA and IOM. And I would say that very rarely in UNHCR do you hear too much that is positive said about those other organisations, let alone a willingness to actually go and see what they're doing and to learn from them.
Thanks, Jeff. This is an interesting remark. And fascinating dive into the world of UNHCR. Emily, you are driving a very incredible organization out of the Silicon Valley. You are immersed in this innovative spirit of the Silicon Valley. Could you tell us about your work and how you have tried to develop your organizational culture and that is definitely adaptive to this new world and new realities.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly have tried to instill innovation throughout our organization. We're still relatively small, certainly compared with something like UNHCR and young, which means that we don't have an innovation unit, but we have tried to build that in. And if I can just ask for the PowerPoint again, whoever's in charge of that. I think it'll maybe be a bit easier to give you some visuals. So Asylum Access works to change the human rights landscape so that refugees can live safely, move freely, work, send their kids to school, rebuild their lives in first countries of refuge. And we do this using 5 tools. So I'll go through them quickly just to give you the background. We provide legal assistance, direct one-on-one legal aid to help refugees assert rights that they've got. We provide community legal empowerment. We help communities figure out how to use their rights and assert their rights collectively without the need for lawyers or external parties. We engage in policy advocacy, direct legislative advocacy, trying to change laws and constitutions and policies that host governments have so that refugees can provide for themselves, can make decisions about their own lives. We use strategic litigation, so once you get a new law passed, you have to make sure that it's enforceable and that it's enforced. And strategic litigation provides a way for us to do that. And then we use movement building. So we look to engage new actors in the movement. We look to link what we're doing with local human rights advocacy organizations that may not have even thought about refugees, as well as with other actors who may not have thought about refugee rights, even though they're in the refugee space. And so we use those 5 tools together, and we use them in our organizations, in the Asylum Access organizations that are established in Ecuador, Thailand, Tanzania, Malaysia, Panama, and Mexico now. And each of these is a local organization in its own right. So we use local leaders. Almost all of our paid staff are locals, and certainly all of our leadership in every country where we work are locals. We found that to be really important. It's not really possible to change policy in a country like Ecuador if someone like me shows up and says, well, Ecuadorian government, I'd like to tell you what I think you should do. They're just not going to listen to me. You need locals who have connections, who are clearly invested and remaining in the community and are looking to build their own community in the direction of refugee human rights. And we also leave a lot of decisions to our local team. So there's a kind of a framework, right? We have these 5 tools. Our offices can use whatever combination of these tools makes sense. But within those bounds and a few other administrative requirements, like you have to, actually keep financial records, within that framework, our local leadership can make decisions about what are the top priorities, what are they hearing from the refugee community, what should be our areas of advocacy, how should we advocate, what's our advocacy strategy. And so instead of having those decisions have to come back to headquarters, our local offices can react and respond to the situation on the ground, and if that situation is changing, they can immediately jump on that and make those changes without having to engage several layers of bureaucracy. We also, as you mentioned, we're in the heart of Silicon Valley. We found that geography has been really helpful. We're outside of Washington, D.C., we're outside of New York, we're outside of Geneva. And so it's much easier for us to kind of think differently in a way. And I certainly felt this at the beginning. I'm the founder of Asylum Access. And I certainly felt at the beginning of Asylum Access especially, that when we were trying not to focus on resettlement, which is only open to about 1% of the world's refugees each year, or on repatriation, which, unfortunately the war is usually not over by Christmas, despite the number of times we tell ourselves that, we were trying to focus on something different. We were trying to focus on rights in first countries of refuge. And this was something no one else was doing. It was really helpful not to be in a place where everyone was saying, well, come to this meeting, or don't you want to work on this with us? We could say, wait, we're going to focus on what we're good at. We're going to focus on this gap that we want to fill. And we're going to do that over here in San Francisco, and then we'll come meet you in Washington or in Geneva when we need to. And the last thing that I think has been helpful for us, just let me make sure I've got the right slide up. Yep. The last thing that's been helpful for us is really focusing on impact. So we're always asking ourselves, and we have learning sessions built in biannually that are more formal, and then just on a continual basis, when we're talking with our overseas offices, we're saying, is it working? Are we having impact? Are we making the change, positive change for refugees that allows them to enjoy their rights and to make choices about their lives. Is it working? If it's not, how do we make it work? If it's working, how can we make it better? And so that's been a really important aspect of our organizational culture. And I think asking those questions over and over again, when you read the literature on leadership generally, they say one of the most important things a leader can do is instill organizational culture and values, and that really micromanaging isn't needed if everyone shares your values and your culture. So asking those questions has helped us to really instill that culture of innovation and impact, right? We don't care how you're getting there as long as you're making that impact. And I think the lessons that we've learned, sorry, I don't have my PowerPoint in front of me. The lessons that we've learned are laws make legal aid meaningful. So we do more legal aid in the countries where the laws are good. In the countries where the laws aren't good, we focus more on changing those laws. We found that community organizing can not only help communities assert their rights, but also provide information. We've learned that changing laws requires telling the right stories to the right people. And I should add, maybe having the right people tell the right stories to the right people, the right decision makers. And we've learned that road mapping strategy, road mapping our advocacy change strategy is really important. So it's not enough to just say, well, we hope that governments will let refugees work. We need to say, okay, if that's the goal, who are the most important influencers? What do we need to do? What do we need to have happen by next year? What do we need to do tomorrow to get there? And drawing that whole roadmap out has been really helpful for us. So those are some of the lessons we've learned. And I'll say, and I guess I'll leave it at that, our goal always is impact. And Jeff, you talked about innovation maybe being a fad. I think for us, innovation is not a fad, but it is just another tool. So the question always is, are we having the impact we want? And if we're not, then how can we innovate to get there? If we are, if something's working, then maybe we scale it or we do something else and we don't innovate, right? So innovation is one of our tools in our toolbox.
Thanks, Emily, for these insightful remarks. Marpe, you're working for MSF, you're working for an innovation unit in Sweden. How do you ensure that the work of your innovation unit is impacting the entire organization?
Yeah, that's not difficult question, but it's a difficult thing to do. And obviously that's the goal when you start something off. And when we look at cases, for example, you have a challenge, okay, we need the innovation unit from Sweden to help us or work with us rather than help, I would say. We always have some things in the back of our head. I wouldn't say there are criteria of selection, but we always look at the first thing is it has to be relevant. It has to be something that will help. It will make it better for the beneficiaries, the patients, or our field workers so that they can do their work better, to have really have that aspect in mind. Secondly, I think also it's important to have a feasibility check in the back of your head also, not technical feasibility, but rather, is there support to do this? Are we dealing with the right persons? Does it have leverage? But also, do we have the right competences, the connections around us? Is the timing right, and so on? And then lastly, I would also say that it's important to look into the impact part. And that's to a certain extent linked to, will this be able to be scaled up and diffused? But also, I think that it doesn't have to be that all the times, but you have to at least consider what the investment will be and what will be the result. So if it's minor, not something very big, then it's okay that it will not be the thing that will change the world, obviously. And this is not something that we grade or something like that, but have in the back of our head, and that we communicate that back. And also that we like to have sort of a design thinking when we work, and it's to really define the need and the problem before we really delve into things, because many times we are presented with solutions to assumed problems, or there are problems, but you may have underlying needs and problems that this solution may not look into. So I think that's important. But then again also, this will vary very much from case or innovation or challenge or opportunity that you're facing. And some of them will be very close to field, while others you need to look outside and become sort of a desk project, really. And then it's difficult to have the field access also because you may not be able to get there. I have one example that we're working with now that is quite interesting from this perspective, because it's a concrete thing. You can see it, right? You can take on it. But I think also it helps to promote this cultural change in regards to innovation, and to get that practical understanding for people throughout the chain. And in the context of the Syrian war, or conflict that we now are seeing, with all the tragedy that comes with, we have projects close to the bordering countries, and one of them is placed in Jordan. Mm-hmm. And there they have been receiving a lot of patients with these wounds that needs to be treated. And in general, we treat these patients with traditional dressing, wound dressing. And I think 1 year ago, something like that, the staff from field started saying, we need to have something else. At least to some type of wounds, we need to improve this. And they were saying, let's try a vacuum-assisted dressing. That is something that is used a lot. It's not an innovation. It exists in a large part of the wealthy part of the world, but it does not in conflict zones. And it has been used little there. But there was again this, okay, we have a solution to an identified problem, but we didn't really know if this will be better, and if it will be better, how much better will it be to justify the cost differences. So what we did was to try to get to the bottom of the problem. We contacted external people from an institution in Sweden that had MSF background, and that way we could use our old and people from our existing networks that are not in the organization at the moment, but have a clear link and motivation for us. And they started to help us with their knowledge, their capacity, and even resources that they could put without us having to pay for it even. And we started to move this around with the HQ, the OC, and we went to field and talked to everybody down there, from patients to the field workers, to see what they think. And in that first round, we really got these insights that, yeah, I mean, the first study protocols, we need to change them because they are not close to reality. But now they are, because we went there and we realized what needs to be done. And then on the second round, we figure everything out. We also managed to get partners from local universities. And that way we started to really sense that people were not only seeing us as somebody that comes here with more work. People were getting very motivated, and so this is something interesting. It's something outside of the regular work, and something that we want to contribute with. And this we saw in the whole chain, sort of, in the field level with the patients, the field workers there, in the coordination level, in HQ level, and externally. And I think that's a good example on how we can manage to change culture by doing. And other cases, no, we don't manage it that well, I would say, but it's because you have to start in the other point and you slowly want to reach down to field. And there is not necessarily just a bottom-up approach or top-down. You have to figure it out along the way. There is no recipes to this.
Thanks, Mabir, for this. Actually, reflecting on the complexity of managing this process of change and adequation with the needs. Andrew, you're working for UN OCHA, the coordinating body of the humanitarian affairs. How do you see the challenge of mainstreaming the process of innovation through the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we look at this at OCHA, and I should also just quickly respond to Jeff. I have 2 strikes against me. I'm ex-IOM for 7 years, and now I work for OCHA. So I guess things aren't looking too good for me. But
this is where you're strategically located.
Opposite ends, right? But yeah, I mean, I think we look at this in 2 ways. One is within OCHA and the need to develop a culture of innovation within the organization. And to be clear, I work in the policy branch, working specifically on innovation within OCHA's policy division. So we're looking mostly at macro level, sort of systemic type issues, as well as trend spotting around innovation in particular. There's a lot of innovation that happens within OCHA that happens outside of my division, of course, and the organization as a whole, I think, is quite innovative and scrappy in terms of looking at new opportunities to improve our processes and better deliver assistance and meet the needs, of affected groups. And of course, in the last year, we've been especially stretched in terms of our mandate. So we have, 5 concurrent level 3 emergencies, the highest level emergency category that we have. And so there's a need to really, if we want to be able to meet the needs, we need to think about how we deliver on things differently. So within the organization, I think maybe there are 4 areas, and a lot of these I think have parallels to the system as well. The first would be the challenge of the existing workload. So just meeting the needs of those crises, the day in, day out that most humanitarian workers face in terms of, delivering on their core obligations. We spoke earlier, Google, for example, putting aside 20% of staff member time to just reflect and think about doing things differently. That is absent within the humanitarian space by and large. So that's a major challenge. I think there's a sense of path dependency, and there's a need for incentives to change. So what is the added value of me being more innovative as a staff member within an organization? There are incentives, I think, like UNHCR uses for like fellowships, for example. It could be a funding mechanism. So we're looking at opportunities to promote the incentives that deliver change. And on the system-wide basis, I think it's the incentives that pull all of us together, again, to be more effectively sharing information and the work that we're doing across the system. The UN, I've been looking a little bit at the private sector in this conversation as well, and trying to draw lessons from the private sector. And in particular, the automobile industry, I think, struggles with issues of both efficiency and agility. And for a large bureaucratic organization like the UN, I think the challenges are similar. On the one hand, you're trying to streamline processes to deliver on your core mandate. On the other hand, you need to build agility into the process at strategic opportunities. And so that's something that we need to figure out better, I think, as a system and also within OCHA. And then finally, I think there's an opportunity for donors to deliver a different outcome, in terms of how we look at funding, looking toward multi-year funding platforms. Too much of the assistance is grounded in response. And I think so long as we sort of have that perspective of just responding quickly to the need of the day, it's going to be difficult for us to turn the corner and look more holistically at the system and delivering on solutions. And part of that, I think, is also incumbent on us as humanitarian actors as well. When we look to new actors involved in the system, whether it's diaspora groups, whether it's the private sector, there are a lot of opportunities that are out there that we increasingly need to bring into the fold. Otherwise, in this age of austerity, we're just going to be circumvented, bypassed, and it's going to be the private sector that's delivering on these solutions. And maybe that's not a bad thing ultimately, but I think it's better for us to be positioned to support that process as opposed to being left behind.
Thanks, Andrew. A fascinating insights in the world of organizational change. It's also picking on your, Jeff, your remark about the evaluation unit not being sufficient to actually impact and affect change. It's really much echoed in this panel. That this is why you need to manage innovation, and it has to be a process. Yes, people have been super innovative, actually, and the refugees in the first place have been innovative, but we have been missing a way to capture, to nurture, and to reward this innovation, to do, as you said, Emily, impact. And you have to measure this action again, impact on the affected population to empower them. So, and it's also about the time and the space you are able to carve for this, and as a leadership, you need to ensure your staff have this ability, even in emergency. You need to find models to allow this. Let's move to another question around, an example of organizational change that you guys have seen in your organization, and what do you think made it possible? We'd like to go for this one. Jeff?
Yeah, coincidentally, Emily started her presentation by talking about the restrictions placed on refugees. And I've actually thought that it's precisely this area where I've seen one of the greatest shifts within UNHCR. So for a very long period of time, roughly from the late 70s until the early 2000s, UNHCR effectively colluded with many refugee hosting states in the implementation of a policy which stated that refugees should be accommodated in camps and dissuaded and even prevented from taking up residence in urban areas. At the same time, those refugees in camps were routinely denied freedom of movement and had little or no access to land, agricultural inputs, capital or the labour market, meaning that they found it impossible to establish livelihoods and become self-reliant. And as a result, they were obliged to rely, as you mentioned earlier, on long-term humanitarian assistance programs. And I think that over the past 5 or 6 years, that policy within UNHCR and that part of UNHCR's organisational culture has largely been overturned. In 2009, as many of you will know, UNHCR issued a new policy stating that refugees had a right to freedom of movement and to take up residence in urban areas, even if this was not approved by the host state. And I think that was quite a radical thing to say, even if not approved by the host state. And then in 2014, last year, the organisation issued another policy statement saying that UNHCR would in all circumstances seek alternatives to camps, and stating that refugees had a right to live not only in urban areas but also alongside the local population in rural locations, again out of camps. Now, what exactly prompted this fairly dramatic policy change and change in UNHCR's organisational culture? I'd like to suggest that perhaps 3 specific factors were at play, and I'll summarise them by saying that the 3 factors were events, advocacy and leadership. Let me just start by saying a few words about events. During the past 5 or 6 years, growing numbers of refugees chose to leave their camps or to bypass them entirely, irrespective of the formal restrictions placed on them. A trend which I think was indicative of the rapid urbanisation of developing countries and the increased mobility of their populations. At the same time, in the same kind of period, UNHCR was confronted with 2 major refugee emergencies, that is Iraq from 2003 onwards and Syria from 2011 onwards, in which the main host states allowed refugees to take up residence in the place of their choice rather than being confined to camps. Thus, 80% of Syrians in Jordan are accommodated outside camps, while Lebanon, which has a Syrian refugee population of some 1.5 million, has not established a single camp on its territory. So I think to some extent the change in culture, the change in policy was driven by events that were essentially beyond the organisation's control. Secondly, in terms of advocacy, I think the change of policy and culture within UNHCR came about as a result of considerable advocacy both within and outside of the organisation. Internally, I'd like to think at least that UNHCR's policy development and evaluation service played something of a role in the sense that it undertook a series of evaluation and assessments of urban refugee situations, and on the basis of those evaluations drafted a new urban refugee policy for the approval of senior management. Externally, and at precisely the same time, NGOs and human rights agencies were increasingly critical of the so-called warehousing of refugees and the restrictions placed on the movement of refugees that are accommodated in camps. And again, I think that internal and external advocacy had quite a determinant effect on UNHCR culture and policy. The third reason I would suggest for UNHCR's policy turnaround on the issue of urban refugees and refugee camps, I think, is to be found in the issue of leadership. Until the mid-2000s, senior management in UNHCR had been essentially split and remained deadlocked on the issue of the organisation's urban refugee policy and whether it should advocate for refugees to live outside of camps. Coming into office in 2005, the new High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, immediately grasped the contradiction of heading a rights-based organisation that was effectively colluding with states in the violation of some basic human rights. At the same time, Guterres brought a new awareness of the need for UNHCR to take full account of what he referred to as global megatrends, including particularly those of urbanisation and migration. Finally, with growing numbers of refugees finding themselves trapped in what are known as protracted refugee situations, he recognised that obliging refugees to rely on humanitarian assistance for years on end was both unethical and unsustainable. So as a result, I think he, as an individual, played quite a leading role in forcing a major policy change and cultural change upon the organisation. Having said that, I guess that the question that now has to be answered is whether a change in policy and a change in culture has actually led to changes in practice and programming. And of course, that is the test of any real change, whether it makes a difference in the lives of the refugees that the organisation is supposed to serve. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Emily?
Yes, and an organizational shift within Asylum Access. So the little known origin story of Asylum Access was that I and some other passionate young refugee rights advocates got together and we said, how do we make refugee rights a reality in more countries? We'd worked in Egypt or Uganda or both, and so we were bringing that experience to bear. But at that time, there were only maybe a single handful of refugee rights organizations in the global south. And this was in 2005, so Asylum Access is celebrating its 10th anniversary. In 2005, as we had this conversation, we said, all right, we need to fund people who want to do refugee rights work, refugee legal aid, refugee rights advocacy in the global south. Let's raise some money and hold a grants process and make some grants. Well, there were two problems with that. One is that a group of young human rights lawyers were not exactly the richest people in the world, not exactly the people who could raise the most money. I wrote a letter literally to everybody I'd known since 7th grade, and we raised maybe $5,000. So we weren't going to have a huge impact that way. And the second problem was that when we did call, we did raise a little bit more than that in total, and we did put out a call for applications. The applications we got back had no idea what it meant to do refugee legal aid or what refugee rights were, or sometimes even who refugees were. So this didn't work very well. And we said, all right, we got to do something different. So then we thought, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to find organizations that we can partner with. We've all done refugee legal aid, refugee rights work on the ground. We're going to find organizations that want to build these programs in, that haven't done them before, and then we'll fundraise for those specific programs. Well, that didn't really work either, because we were a bunch of unknown, young kids from the US coming in saying, oh, we want to partner with you. And of course, organizations that had been working on other refugee issues for many, many years, not necessarily in the refugee rights space, said, who are you? We don't know, why would we partner with you? So we said, all right, new plan. This is all in the space of 2 years. We said, all right, we think we have some experience from Egypt and Uganda. We think it can be adapted to other places. We know local leadership is important. We're going to find a single local innovator, first in Ecuador and then in Thailand, and we're going to support them, and they're going to work with us. We're going to raise the money. We're going to support the development of refugee rights advocacy in these two countries. And that finally worked. So it took us about 2 years of kind of trying these different things, failing rapidly, failing forward, learning from what we did wrong, and then finally coming up with the model that is Asylum Access today. That said, I think we're also at the cusp of another organizational shift. So as I said, Asylum Access has operations in 6 countries outside the US, 6 countries where we do our programmatic work. These are all independent NGOs that are affiliated with Asylum Access, but they're all branded Asylum Access, they're all named Asylum Access. And so we have to exercise some degree of quality control, and we have an integrated set of global financial books and things like that actually take a lot of resources in San Francisco, which is not an inexpensive city. And so we've been thinking about what is it that really is the core of our model, and can we achieve the same impact, but in a cheaper way, in a way that uses our resources more effectively. And so we've built, or we're building, what we call our Refugee Rights Toolkit, essentially an unbranded franchise model. What's really core to our model, we realized, was identifying these local innovators, these local leaders, who can start a refugee rights organization, given our model, given our tools, being able to learn from our offices, and then can build something in their own country. If it's not branded Asylum Access, if it doesn't bear our name, then we don't have to have the same level of quality control and kind of expensive oversight that we have with our existing offices. Now, we'll keep our existing offices. We want to continue to have laboratories for best practice, places where we can try things out collectively. But we're also going to use this toolkit to establish a whole bunch more, or support the establishment of a whole bunch more refugee rights organizations. Mm-hmm. My personal goal, although my staff might kill me for saying this, is within a decade we want to have 100 organizations that are fighting for refugee rights in their countries. And we're going to do this cheaply and more quickly, because we'll be able to identify the right people, provide them with the same kind of coaching that our local staff receive, but not have to have the same level of financial investment that we do with our Asylum Access offices. So that's kind of the next phase of innovation for us.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Emily.
Yeah.
Another general question about what do you see the areas for transformation organization within the humanitarian world, and what can be done about them? Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I
sorry to put the spot on you.
Just shifting gears quickly. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of space for transformation. One of which, and it kind of relates to the previous question as well. I mean, around the private sector in particular, I think this is a space that we are increasingly looking toward to help us in developing solutions, as well as to finance the solutions as well. I think the social impact investing space, coupled with the private sector, they have some solutions that they've already developed. It's an industry that's already familiar to one another. We may as well be calling on that industry to help us to resolve some of these issues. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon humanitarian actors to come up with the challenges ourselves and to be forthcoming in telling the private sector, if we're going to engage with them, what those challenges are. I think that's a real opportunity for us, and especially coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, when a lot of organizations were heavily affected by austerity measures. I mean, it just calls to the need to develop these types of solutions that are sort of outside of the box and that we haven't previously explored.
And this is actually, as Massa was saying yesterday, through the World Humanitarian Summit, it's also an opportunity to highlight this organizational change that are going to impact affected population, and then also about this paradigm shift or the business model shift. So it is an opportunity. Another question around, how can we better use human resources to empower people to become entrepreneurs within organizations, and also to contribute to this organizational change? Who would like to take this one?
I can try to answer that, or at least my perspective from it is that if you want to have people to be more innovative and be entrepreneurs, which I would say is entrepreneurs would be people that take a bit more control of their situation rather than wait for somebody to tell them what to do, right? Or wait for, okay, I need a higher budget to do this, or I need a better position or whatever. I think that people like that try to do the best of their situation. With that said, I think also that you need to create spaces for this kind of mentality and way of working to actually happen. So if you have people that are willing to do that, you also have to have people higher up that are willing to support this. And if you do that, or how to do that, is by creating the incentives. So if you talk about cultural change, it's not just something, okay, now we decide that this will be our new culture, right? This has to be something that grows up socially within the organization. The organization in the end is the people that works with it, and it is the patients that we're looking into, and that mix, and of course the whole ecosystem outside also. But we have to realize that to do that, you also have to provide incentives to the people, to the individual, not just saying, okay, this is the direction we're going to go. Because in the end we know that people, yes, of course, they care of the organization, what we're doing, but what they're worried and troubled about in their everyday life is their work, what they see in front of them. So how can you create situations where they can see also that the big vision also can help them in their own vision on how they can improve their work so that they can do their part to improve the whole organization? How can you get there? And I think ways to do that is that we are also looking into within our team and talking to others, is to identify, okay, what is your situation today as a person and as an organization? And what is perhaps the vision? Where would you like to be? But besides that, and more importantly, is to say, okay, how do you get the steps to get there? Not like, okay, in 1 year, no. What will I do on Monday? One thing. What will I do in 1 month? Half a year? That way, like concrete things. Otherwise, it becomes too fluffy.
That's right.
And I think that's one example. And of course, how that will look in practice for each people, organization, of course, that will vary.
Thanks. Any other comments?
I mean, I could just add that we engaged with LinkedIn recently, on a variety of issues, but that's a great example of a private sector organization that is willing and able to come into our space and help us to deliver the right appropriate HR solutions. One of which is, like in the Nepal earthquake context, compiling a roster of UAV operators who would be willing to go to Nepal. Now, I mean, UAVs have their own set of issues, so we weren't convinced that that was the right solution necessarily, but that's the power of that tool that could be applied to the humanitarian context.
And that's actually fascinating, because this is also what the private sector can bring in terms of good practice. If you look at companies like IKEA or Google, they do not have an innovation unit, because the innovation is ingrained into the DNA of the organization, and staff are actually either given the space or the leadership direction that actually innovation is essential in order to change, in order to always remain relevant. And this is an interesting dimension that we can maybe learn how they do this enabling environment in a very effective way.
But I think also when we talk about human resources, again, we have to talk about what are the human resources in our ecosystem, right? I said before, someone who looks like me is not going to convince the Ecuadorian government to make changes, right? I'm not the right human resource, and it doesn't matter how innovative I am. So we also need to open the ecosystem, and I think one of the places that we have not yet managed to innovate, but that we can, is by bringing in local advocacy groups, local NGOs, who are able to engage in this, in dismantling those restrictions I talked about. And I think that's what's needed, because you talked about innovating, having quick wins in innovation. And I think you get quick wins in innovation in product and process. But as we heard from Sarah in the keynote this morning, there's also position and paradigm. And innovations in paradigm shift, that's not something you're going to do in 6 months. So the people who can do that and are the local advocacy organizations, and the investment in that is going to take time, and we need to make sure we don't get stuck in the quick wins part of innovation. We need the quick wins, but we also need the long-term paradigm shift, and that means bringing in new human resources to the movement.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this, Emily. We're going to open up now to a question from the audience. So we're going to take, yes, go ahead. We have a microphone. So time is of essence. We have to finish by 3:15. So if you can make short remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Willis is my name. Thanks for some rich discussions. I'm still reflecting on these transforming organizational cultures and focusing on the bureaucracies, I mean the UN agencies, and also drawing from this morning's keynote address. And I'm thinking about the leadership in these bureaucracies, and going by what we usually say that, look, rule number one, the boss is right. I will not go to rule number two, but focusing on that. And I'm also looking at the other second bit about disruptors. In most cases, these disruptors, depending on the leadership, depending on rule number one, are usually seen as perhaps wrong, if not bad people. Now, there's also the third bit, the third group of people, the auditors. We are also scared of these auditors, and everything we do it having in mind what the auditors will say at the end of the day, and especially in the emergency context where we say that the rules still have to, we still have to follow the rules. Now, with these three, I'm really wondering, the culture, we're talking about changing cultures. I mean, you rightly say that cultures are not usually, are not easily codified. How do we want to define culture, and how do we want to go about changing this? And basically, when we talk about innovation, whose work is it to innovate at the end of the day when I'm thinking about the rule number one? Yeah, I mean.
Thank you. We're going to take a few questions. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for your presentations. How important was vocabulary useful in helping drive organizational change around innovation? I'll give you the example. I recently set up a project management office within MSF, and the first time I used the word business case, somebody threatened to hit me and send me out of the room. And now I can use business case, project charter, these kinds of things in fluent conversation, and everybody knows what I'm talking about, so they can engage with me. So I ask you, how important are words around innovation, living lab, these kinds of things, important in driving organizational culture towards innovation?
Yes. And then we're going to start answering.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I have just one quick comment and a question. My quick comment is that when we talk about innovations, we're really talking about humanitarian institutional adaptation and change, and of course that's the topic of this meeting, but I sometimes fear that when we talk about innovations, we are actually implying that. And if so, I find it a little bit of a problem, because if we call it innovation, we do sound like we're doing a one-off program that is short and snazzy and attractive to donors. And I think the problem is that we then avoid the huge elephant in the room, which is organizational change. I find it particularly challenging, and I'd like to a certain extent, ask as well the panel. It is a problem when one person or one unit is put in charge of that, because it also washes off completely the responsibility, I believe, of senior managers of organizations to actually meaningfully look into change and what are the issues around the obstacles around change. My question then is, would you additionally add, perhaps Jeff, on the obstacles, one or two more reasons for those obstacles to organizational change? One is the recognition of mistakes. I think organizations are not very good at recognizing mistakes, and I think that's probably one of the critical issues around evaluation. We just keep it internal and we can't share it, and nobody can see this. Again, it links into reputation and donor and funding, but I do think it also links into something bigger, which is my second point, around lack of accountability in our HR processes. We are not held, we do not hold many people into account for the jobs that we do, particularly because we're a charity. And again, that links into accountability to beneficiaries and the people that we serve. They're not paying for our services, and therefore we don't really have accountability to the services that we're providing. So I wondered if you could perhaps shed a bit of light on these erratic thoughts of mine. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Who would like to?
I would like to pick up a bit on the last one. I think that was interesting about the recognizing mistakes. And I think that's something that we actually hear all the time, that we need to accept mistakes. Yes. But I think many times that's where it ends. We say it, but do we really mean it? It's like, okay, we accept mistakes, but but I also think that, and this ties a bit back to Robin's question about the importance of terminology, right? That we hear, you start to use these phrases, the terms of business models and agility and so on, and after some time people get used to them, right? And it's normal, and I think it's very important to have it. Then on the other side, we should not abuse them and just use them up as hyped words, which innovation to a great extent is being used today, for sure. So I think that in the same line with that, I think that we have to also accept that we have to recognize mistakes and actually mean it. And there were some really interesting things that happened within our organization. We have a very fresh example when we were talking in our internal innovation group, and one of the guys said that, yeah, he got a lump sum of money, and his boss said basically, you can make a mistake with this. It's okay if you fail. If you succeed, of course it's better, but then you can scale it up. We provide a bigger budget, but if you fail in the right direction. So I think that's a shift that we would not have seen 3 years ago that we see today. And I think that happens in many different places. Again, that doesn't mean that you can take away accountability of people, right? Because in the end, what we do, if we're going to work with what we do, we have very serious ethical problems. If we're not doing what we would in the right direction, this is not about money, it's about people's life and health and livelihood and so on. So I think it's very delicate and we have to be careful. On the other side, we also have, you can turn that also and you can say, yes, but it's not ethical right to just do something as it always has been done just because of that, knowing that you could improve it if you tried it. So, yeah.
Thanks. Emily?
I think that you're absolutely right, and I don't think I've heard in this entire conference really any clear proposal for how we resolve the tension between it being okay to make mistakes and accountability for impact. There's a great book out there that talks about innovation that is called Switch, and one of the stories in that book, if I'm remembering it correctly, and bear with me, I might have it a little wrong, but if I remember correctly, it's about NASA. Which is the United States Space Exploration Organization. It spends taxpayer money, which means that it needs a lot of taxpayer money to build something that's going to go out in space. And that means that if you screw up and you send something out into space that's supposed to, collect data, and instead it blows up when it exits the atmosphere, you've wasted a lot of taxpayer money. It's just gone up in smoke. And at the same time, the only way that we were going to get further with all of our research in space exploration was if we tried things that we weren't sure would work. And so what NASA ended up doing, according to the book, is having a deliberate celebration. If someone sent something out that was millions of dollars and it just exploded and didn't work at all, everyone cheered and clapped. And they used that to switch from it being not okay to fail with these huge amounts of money to it's okay to try things and fail. And you still had to fail responsibly, right? There were still other protocols in place that made sure that you weren't just, being totally crazy. But this was a way of bringing that innovation culture in. Now, at the same time, when it's people's lives on the line, do we want to say, oh, you tried something and it failed and lots of people died? We don't want to all cheer for that. That would be a problem. So I don't think we've really resolved this tension. I don't think we have an answer to that. And what would be maybe interesting to see is some proposals for what are the ethical boundaries around that. How do we resolve that tension? How do we come up with, one or a few options that allow both space for innovation and also accountability for impact?
And this is actually one of the pillars of the World Humanitarian Summit, where there's a principle, and ethics and principle that we're trying to collectively come forward with, on the basis of the do not harm principle, right. But do this in a collaborative way in order to provide these kind of guidelines on how to do that. Jeff, you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly to link two of the issues raised by the members of the audience, that is the questions of evaluation and leadership. And I think there's a whole separate conversation we could have some time about the extent to which evaluation does and can act as a kind of engine for change within the humanitarian sector and within specific organisations. Certainly, as I've already mentioned in my previous comments, I personally believe that evaluation does have a very significant potential for change, as long as it's done well and the timing is right, and the independence of the function is respected. But I would also have to say that from my own experience that the potential that evaluation has to act as a kind of motor for change is not always realised. And I've kind of thought about this quite a lot. Why isn't that potential realised? I think one of the problems is as follows. In my experience, every year I would have a meeting with each of the key donor states to UNHCR, and one of the first questions they would almost invariably ask me is, well, Jeff, what are you doing to make sure your recommendations are implemented? And it seems like a bit like a kind of cop-out, but I used to say, well, you're asking the wrong person. I don't control the resources, human resources, financial resources, or even the policies that actually lead to change. You should be going to the High Commissioner saying, here's your evaluation report that your evaluation unit's commissioned. What the hell are you doing about its recommendations? Not coming to ask me. And I think the real danger that I saw of function like evaluation in UNHCR, it becomes a very symbolic function rather than a substantive one. It's there so the High Commissioner and senior management can say, yes, we totally believe in evaluation, we're putting a lot of money into it, it's a completely independent function, look how good we are. But in fact, taking up the recommendations and using them for change is something that's not often done. And that also brings up the role of the donors, the responsibility of the donors to take evaluation seriously and to make sure that they are used for change by senior management.
And it's also what we heard in the conference about the need for evidence-based, the need for data collection that is linked to evaluation, but goes to the next level because then it becomes operational. There's also a question about the barriers. If you could go
I didn't
through
quite catch the question. Sorry.
Any other elements that you can identify as barriers of transformation. What are the obstacles that you can see from an organization standpoint?
Well, again, speaking from a personal perspective, I always placed a great deal of emphasis on establishing good external relationships and encouraging external actors to act as critics or as promoters of change within my own organisation. So I think actually building up an alliance outside the organisation is an extremely important function.
Great, thanks. We're going to take 3 more questions and then we'll have to wrap up. Yes? Sorry, the microphone.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Laura. I work with World Vision, and it's been a very interesting conversation so far, so thank you for that. I really just wanted to ask about this piece, this idea of innovation across organisations and how we actually share as different actors within the humanitarian system. And certainly my own perception is that there is a closed-mindedness in the system. There's a reluctance to share ideas, but then there's also a reluctance to take on ideas which aren't necessarily our own. So just speaking from a World Vision example, World Vision invested in developing the last mile mobile solution, LMMS, which for those of you that don't know is a software package that allows you to register and distribute cash and other payments. And while there has been some good uptake in several partners, the large-scale actors haven't got on board with that. There has been, in my perception, a reluctance and a resistance to take on an idea that isn't necessarily homegrown. And I'm just wondering around this idea of innovation units in-house and whether that actually perpetuates this idea that we have to develop the ideas ourselves. Because when we look at things like the M-Pesa technology, it actually wasn't developed by Safaricom. It was developed by another organisation, but it has been taken to scale. So I just wonder what your comments are around that.
Good question, thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is about funding and how the use of donor money is implemented in some of the programs the UN runs. For example, in Somalia in 2014 and 2013, the UN has been calling for more donations to respond to emerging crisis that they were afraid of slipping back to the 2011 deadly famine. Yet, as they were calling for more donations in some parts of the UN body, you will find that they're having another internal meetings, like trying to make use of other resources, other money that is not fully utilized, and they're like being pressurized to, like, we have only 2 months to use like all these hundreds of thousands of money. There's food crisis, malnutrition here, and on this other end, in the same organization, different programs, like they're talking about using hundreds of thousands of money to reach, like in the next 3 months, because this money is going to expire. So how can innovation come into these kind of situations to save lives at the same time, report to the relevant donors to be accountable to their money? Thank you.
Thank you. Question here?
Thank you. And I want to add a little bit to what Jeff said about the changes in UNHCR. I also had 25 years, but I joined a bit earlier than him. So I left earlier too. But I think the change to the out-of-camp policy actually took much longer time than the 2005 and upwards that Jeff mentioned. I think we started talking about this in the early 90s. Even I run into representatives of UNHCR today that, hey, I was in a workshop with you 12 years ago when we started talking about self-reliance. Now I better understand what it is. So it has taken decades to get there. And that's, if you want to change organizations, you have to be persistent with your message and be prepared to be slapped in the face every so often and carry on. And you should be willing to challenge your bosses at the risk of your own livelihoods. Also, and there was another comment about auditors. We are scared of auditors. If you know you do the right thing, to hell with the rules and the auditors. Deal with them later. And that should be the attitude. And then you can have some possibilities for change. also. And one last point, we talked, there were some good points about rights of refugees. I think we have created dependency syndrome and an entitlement syndrome by having the wrong approach of care and maintenance for decades. So if we want to change this, we have to add in the issue of refugees' duties as well. Because if they get the opportunity to work, they have a duty to actually take advantage of that. So this has to be part of the equation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm happy, with the conversation about the funding issue. I mean, I do think a lot of this comes back to how donors are funding us. And another concept that's coming out of the World Humanitarian Summit process is the possibility of setting up an endowment fund that pools, collectively donor resources around humanitarian innovation. That would allow us, I think, to look more systematically at the process, sort of getting to Laura's question as well. I mean, I think, if we have a common pool of funds, if we have stipulations within calls for proposals that require, that mandate, that World Vision's product is widely shared, and I'm sure it was, but that coupled with the fund wouldn't be funding another product that's exactly the same as that for another organization, and your product would be shared more widely. So it has to be brought together, I think, within that space, and I think donors have a lot of responsibility in that respect.
Thanks.
I think, in a way, Niels kind of answered, or has an answer to Laura's question when you say, how do we get organizations to take up ideas that aren't their own and to share ideas? Some of that is you have to be persistent with these ideas. You have to keep sharing them and keep encouraging their use. And I don't want to miss the humanitarian NGO responsibility for that. At the same time, I also think that funders not only can encourage sharing, but also funders are just like the rest of us, are very excited by innovation and kind of the new shiny, new jazzy idea. And we need funding to scale what does work, to implement solutions we already know about rather than innovating new ones if those solutions work and if they just need to be shared or scaled up. And so I think that's important. And I also think Niels maybe answered your question about HR. It sounds like the answer is, hire the cowboys and the cowgirls who are willing to go against their bosses, to keep being persistent, to get slapped in the face, because that's how we're going to achieve organizational change. So that might be something for us all to look for as we're putting together our next hires, right?
Exactly. Organization change takes courage. Jeff, you want to come in?
Well, just one quick comment. In my earlier comments, I made use of the concept of the humanitarian marketplace on several occasions, and I observed the fact that the humanitarian marketplace had become more competitive in recent years. And something that hadn't occurred to me before, just occurred to me this afternoon, is where does innovations sit within this field of competition? All right. In fact, are organizations embracing the notion of innovation because it feels it gives them a competitive edge in the humanitarian marketplace? And if that's the case, does it mean that they're going to be less likely to share their innovations with each other because they want to reap the rewards themselves for the innovations that they've been able to establish?
Thanks. We have time for one more question.
So my question...
One second, we'll give you the microphone.
Hi, my name is Camila, and I come from Endless Computers from the Valley as well. And it's pretty interesting to me to be attending this event because it's very rich to listen to all of the debates, and I'm trying to figure out how the computers we are producing to empower people who have never used computers before, how can we create something that it's a co-creation? Because technology is, I've heard from so many people in this environment that technology has a strong power to change paradigms and to innovate. But it's also very difficult if you do something that's not right. And so when you go to the refugee environment, and I'm going to live in Jordan for 3 months to go and deploy and donate 1,000 computers, and I'm having trouble to donate them because of bureaucracy. So what I want to propose and to listen from you, and especially from you, Emily, because you're involved in both things, how can we take co-responsibility on this process? And also taking advantage of her question about when we make mistakes, how can we learn together? And if the institutions that are on the field, if they are ready to prototype, to make mistakes, to learn together, and to bring to the private sector the possibility of making those mistakes and to correct them, and so to offer solutions together. Right now, as an endless ground researcher, it's totally possible for me to make mistakes and to learn from them. When it comes to getting involved with a huge institution, like let's say UNHCR, and we go to the field and we make a mistake, how can we collaborate to solve that problem? How can we communicate to people, focus on the local needs so that they understand that's a prototype, and that in case something goes wrong and goes right, it's a co-creation process. So thank you.
Thanks for this.
Sure. I think my answer, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity, although I think this fits with the Asylum Access philosophy, is it sounds like you're looking to co-create with refugee-serving organizations. And I would encourage you to co-create with refugees themselves. Rather than going through big bureaucracies, go around them. Go to Mafraq and talk to anyone on the street, and chances are that person's going to be a refugee. If you want to create a focus group, you can do it just by sitting in the local coffee shop. So I would encourage that as your kind of method of co-creation, particularly given that you're trying to do this quickly. And I also think that maybe one of the reasons that we tend to think about going to an organization rather than going directly to the refugee community addresses a little bit of the question about vocabulary, that we really have not yet shifted ourselves out of this idea of refugees as the people with needs but not the people with rights. I mean, we should eliminate care and maintenance from our vocabulary. That sounds like a zoo animal. It's not appropriate to use for human beings. And so if we can rethink how we approach refugee communities and kind of continually ask ourselves, can we get refugees involved at the front and center? Can we make them the co-creators? Can we be sitting down with them and asking them questions? I think that will help us to shift ourselves. But we have to ask those questions continually because we're bombarded by these messages, by this vocabulary and by these messages that don't facilitate that.
Emily, we're going to end on this very powerful message. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank these great panelists